The night he called my name, my actual name, not Miss Dempsey, not my assistant, not the clipped two-syllable thing he said across the boardroom table, I knew something had shifted. I just didn't know yet if it was in me, or in him, or in the whole fragile arrangement we'd built around, pretending neither of us noticed the other. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Willa Dempsey. I'm 28 years old. I work as a paralegal at one of Toronto's more quietly intimidating corporate law firms. And for the past 14 months I have been convincing myself that the life I was living made sense. It didn't, but that's the thing about denial. It's very comfortable until it isn't. I met Brendan at a rooftop birthday party in Kensington Market, the summer before everything fell apart. He was standing near the fire escape, with a can of Molson in his hand, looking like someone who'd wandered in from a different, better party. Dark hair, easy smile, the kind of jaw that made you forget you were smarter than this. We talked until the skyline went from pink to black. He texted me the next morning. We were together by the following weekend. Looking back, I can see all the things I missed. Or rather, I can see the things I noticed but chose to file away under he's just intense. Or he had a hard week. Or I probably shouldn't have worn that. The way he'd check my phone when he thought I was asleep. The way dinner could pivot from easy to terrible in the time it took me to laugh too loud at something a coworker said. The way he tracked my route home, and I told myself it was sweet, that it meant he cared. He did care. That was the worst part. I believe that. He cared in the way that certain things care, the way a fist cares about a wall, the way a closed door cares about everything on the other side of it. By the time I got the job at Hargreave and Locke, Brendan and I had been together for almost a year. I'd moved into his condo in Liberty Village, one of those sleek glass and steel buildings on East Liberty Street, the kind where the lobby smells like money and the concierge never quite looks you in the eye. I told myself it was practical. The TTC was close. We were splitting costs. What I was actually doing was making myself small enough to fit inside someone else's life. The firm was different from anything I'd worked at before. Not in a bad way. In the way that made you feel like you'd stepped through a door you didn't know existed. The offices were on the 32nd floor of a building on Bay Street, all glass and dark oak, with a view of the lake that I never got tired of, even in January when everything outside was gray and brutal, and the wind off Lake Ontario made your eyes water just crossing Front Street. My direct supervisor was Mr. Ashby, Cormac Ashby. The name itself sounded like a verdict. He was one of 3 senior partners at the firm, the one who handled the cases nobody talked about at dinner parties, the ones involving asset protection, corporate restructuring, quiet international negotiations that the partners referred to only as sensitive matters. He was 36, Irish-Canadian by way of his parents, raised in Halifax, trained in London, and had been back in Toronto for 8 years, building something that people in certain circles described in careful measured terms with their eyes moving slightly to the left. I didn't know any of that when I started. I just knew he was tall, that he wore suits the way other men wear skin, and that he said exactly as many words as a situation required, and not one more. He called me Miss Dempsey for the first 4 months. He called me that even when he was handing me a coffee he'd ordered specifically the way I like it. Oat milk, 1 sugar, always a cup of water on the side, without ever having asked. He called me that when he stayed late on a Thursday night, because my file had an error, and he sat across from me at the conference table and walked through it without making me feel like an idiot. He called me that when he handed me his jacket in the parking garage in March, because I'd come in without a coat and I was shaking, and he said, "Take it. Miss Dempsey, you'll be useless to me with frostbite." I tucked all of that away. I was good at tucking things away. Things at home had gotten quieter in a way that felt worse than the noise. Brendan had started a new project. Something with a startup he'd connected with through a friend in Waterloo, and he was stressed in a way that sat on him like weather, like something you could feel before it arrived. He didn't yell much anymore, he just withdrew, and I learned that the withdrawal was its own kind of punishment, because it meant I spent most evenings trying to figure out what I'd done and how to undo it. I stopped seeing my friends. Not all at once, gradually, the way you don't notice the temperature dropping until you're already cold. Renata, my best friend since Ryerson, started texting less. I told her I was busy. She believed me for a while. Then she stopped asking. My sister Joanna called from Ottawa every few weeks. I answered maybe half the time. The other half, I'd watch her name on my screen and feel something close to shame that I couldn't explain. In April, Brendan came to pick me up from work. He'd never done that before. I was in the elevator with Mr. Ashby when I got the text that he was downstairs, and I remember watching the floor numbers tick down and feeling a strange knot form in my stomach. Nothing about it made sense. Brendan picking me up was technically a nice thing, but my body knew things my brain was still refusing to process. He was standing in the lobby in a good mood. That was almost worse. He brought me flowers, grocery store tulips, still in the plastic, and he shook hands with Mr. Ashby, who had come down to meet a client, and he smiled the way he smiled in public, easy and open, and I watched Mr. Ashby look at him and then look at me, and something moved across his face so quickly, I almost missed it. He said nothing. Of course he said nothing. But that night, walking back to the elevator, I caught him watching Brendan through the lobby glass, and his jaw was set in a way I'd never seen before. I told myself I'd imagined it. By June, things were bad enough that I was cataloging them. I'd started keeping a note in my phone. Not a diary, nothing that sentimental, just a list, a date and a sentence. May 3rd, through the water glass, said it slipped. May 19th, locked bathroom door from outside, forgot to mention he'd done it. June 1st, said I was the reason he was like this. I don't know what I was planning to do with the list. I think I was just trying to make it real. When you're inside something, it has a way of dissolving around you. The list made it solid. The list said, "This is actually happening." The Friday it finally broke open, I was supposed to be at a firm event, a summer reception at the Four Seasons. The kind of thing Hargreave and Locke did twice a year, where everyone wore navy and talked about golf. I'd told Brendan about it weeks earlier. He'd said fine. He'd said it was fine 3 separate times. At 6 o'clock, standing in the bathroom of our condo in a dress I'd borrowed from Renata, I got the look. The one that started in his eyes before it reached his voice. He said he didn't realize it was tonight. He said I'd never told him. He said I was lying, and I remember very clearly the moment I decided not to agree with him, which was new, which felt like standing on ice that hadn't been tested yet. I went to the event. I don't know what it cost me, going. But I went. I made it about an hour before I got the first message. Then the second. By the third, I was standing in the corridor outside the ballroom, and a server passed with a tray, and I pressed my back against the wall and typed back, and felt the whole evening tipping sideways. I didn't hear him approach. I didn't hear anything until Mr. Ashby was standing beside me, not in front, not making it a thing, just quietly beside me. Said, in the same voice he used to discuss quarterly filings, "Everything all right, Miss Dempsey?" I said yes. I said I was fine. I said something about the noise in the ballroom. He looked at the phone in my hand, at the way my fingers had gone white around the case, and said nothing. Just stood there, not leaving, not pushing, just present, in the way that some people are when the room needs ballast. After a moment, he said, "There's a car downstairs if you need to go." I said I was fine. He nodded and went back inside. I lasted another 20 minutes. Then I called a cab and went home and spent the rest of the night managing the fallout, which involved a door slammed hard enough to rattle the medicine cabinet and a very long, very cold walk to the Tim Hortons on King Street at 11 o'clock, because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't there. I sat in the Tim Hortons with a medium double-double I didn't drink, and I looked at my phone, and I thought about calling Renata and I didn't. I thought about calling Joanna and I didn't. I thought about a lot of things. I walked home at midnight. Brendan was asleep. I lay next to him in the dark and listened to him breathe and felt something calcifying in my chest, some small, stubborn thing that had decided it was done being soft. The second week of July, he followed me to work. I didn't know he'd done it until I saw him in the lobby at noon when I came down to grab lunch. He was standing near the security desk with his hands in his pockets, and for a second, the sight of him just confused me. My brain didn't know where to put him, standing in the glass and marble lobby of the firm on a Tuesday, and then I understood, and the confusion became something else. He said he was in the area. He said he wanted to take me for lunch. He said it the way you say something you've rehearsed, watching for the seams in my response. I had a deposition prep at 1:30. I told him that. He said it would be quick. I said I couldn't. He said, and this is the part I remember very clearly, because the security guard at the desk had turned slightly toward us. He said quietly, in a register no one else could catch. "I just need to know you're not doing something you shouldn't be." I said I had to go back upstairs. He left. I stood in the elevator going up, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I missed my floor and rode back down to the lobby, and back up again before I could make them stop. When I walked past the open door of Mr. Ashby's office, he looked up from his desk. I don't know what was on my face. He stood up. I said, "I'm fine," he said. "Come in and close the door." I sat in the chair across from his desk, and he put a glass of water in front of me, just produced it, from the credenza behind him, like he'd been keeping it ready, and he sat down and didn't say anything for a moment, which was characteristic. And then he said, "Who was that in the lobby?" I said it was nobody. I said it was my boyfriend. I said he just stopped by. Mr. Ashby said he's done this before. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer it. I drank the water. I said I should get back to the Mercer file, and he said the Mercer file would be there in 5 minutes, and he asked me again, and this time it landed differently. Not like an accusation, not like pity, but like a hand extended across a table that had been set between us, and I could take it or not. I said, "It's a complicated situation." He said, "I imagine it is." He didn't push after that. He went back to his work and I went back to mine, and at the end of the day he came by my desk and put a card down, the card of a senior associate he described as a personal contact, someone who handled family law and situations he called transitions, and said, "In case it's ever useful." I put the card in my wallet. I told myself it was just a resource. I told myself I was fine. I was not fine. The August long weekend, Brendan and I went up to his family's cottage near Calabogie, the way we had the year before, and it should have been the kind of weekend that resets things. The lake, the quiet, the slow mornings with coffee, and nobody's phone doing anything urgent. Instead, by Saturday afternoon, I was sitting on the end of the dock with my feet in the water, and I was trying very hard to remember a version of myself from before all of this, and I couldn't quite reach her. Sunday night after dinner, I made the mistake of laughing at something on my phone. A voice note from Joanna, who had sent me a video of her dog doing something ridiculous, and Brendan asked to see what was funny. I showed him. He watched the video. He looked at the conversation thread above it. He saw a message from a coworker, Philip, who was 63 and grandparental and had never once made anything complicated. That said, "Great work on the Mercer brief. Willa Ashby was really impressed." Just that. 11 words. He broke my phone. Not dramatically. Not in a movie way. He just pressed it against the edge of the kitchen counter, methodically, until the screen cracked through. Then he put it down and walked outside. I sat at the cottage table for a long time after that. Then I went to find him. Because that was what I did. I went to find him, and I managed the situation, and we drove back to Toronto on Monday morning in near silence, and I spent the 3-hour drive on the 417 looking at the tree line and thinking about the card in my wallet. I got a new phone on my lunch break Tuesday. I transferred my contacts. I put Cormac Ashby in my phone, Mr. Ashby work, and then I sat in the Rogers store on Queen Street and I thought, if something happens, there is one person who already knows. That was the closest I came to courage for a while. September was cold. Toronto went cold early that year, the way it sometimes does. Not gradually, but in one long exhale. The maple in the park near our building going from green to yellow to bare in what felt like 2 weeks. I started wearing my own jacket to work. I stopped apologizing for laughing at things. I started to rebuild the list in my new phone. Brendan noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed in the way that controlling people notice. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one making him tighter. The night everything broke, it was a Wednesday. I know it was a Wednesday because I'd been working late on a filing that needed to be in by 9 the next morning. And I'd texted Brendan at 7 to say I wouldn't be home for dinner, and he'd said okay. And that okay had felt wrong in the way that certain sounds feel wrong before a storm. I was still at my desk at 9:15 when I heard the elevator. I thought it was the cleaning crew. It was not the cleaning crew. He walked through the glass doors of the office with the look on his face that I'd learned to recognize from across a room, and he said, very carefully, the way he said things when he was most frightened me, that I was going to come home now. I said the filing wasn't done. He said he didn't care about the filing. There was a moment, one of those moments that stretches in a way that real time doesn't, where I understood that I was at the end of something, that this was the place where the road either continued or it didn't. I picked up my phone. I went to my contacts. I don't know why I did it instead of calling 911. I think because I'd been through that calculation before, lying awake at night, and I'd decided that a report, a conversation, a system wasn't what I needed. I needed someone who would come. Someone I'd watched make a decision and carry it, cleanly, without hesitation. I called Mr. Ashby. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "I don't know who else to call. I'm at the office. Can you please come get me?" he said. "Don't hang up." I heard the sound of a chair, footsteps, a door. I held the phone against my chest and looked at Brendan and said, in a voice I didn't entirely recognize, "I called someone. They're coming." He said some things after that. I remember the shape of them, but not the words. It's one of those places where memory decides to be merciful. What I remember is that I didn't agree with any of it. I stood next to my desk with my hand around my phone, and I did not agree, and that felt like something. Mr. Ashby was there in 11 minutes. I know this because I'd been watching the clock on my computer, with an intensity that I still associate, all these months later, with the smell of cold air from a fire door. He walked in through the emergency stairwell, not the elevator, not the main doors, and I found out later he'd had the access code to that entrance since before I joined the firm, which was one of the many things that, at the time, I simply accepted as part of the strange geography of who he was. He looked at Brendan. Brendan looked at him. I don't know what passed between them in that moment. I wasn't watching Cormac's face. I was watching Brendan's, and what I saw there was something I'd never seen before. Uncertainty, something in him recalibrating. Cormac said, "You're going to leave now." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just said it the way you say a fact, the way you say the highway is closed or the building is on fire. And Brendan, after a long moment that I will never quite be able to describe, left. The elevator doors closed behind him. I sat down on the floor next to my desk, which was not dignified, but dignity was not available to me in that moment. Cormac came and sat down a few feet away on the carpet, which surprised me so completely that it almost made me laugh, and he said, "Take your time." We sat there for a while. At some point he said, "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" I said I did. I called Renata. She answered on the first ring, and the sound of her voice, "Willa, hey, I've got you. Come over, I'm making tea, get here," undid something in me that I'd been holding together for a long time. Cormac drove me to her apartment in Little Portugal. He didn't make it a thing. He just drove, and when we pulled up in front of Renata's building, he said, "The filing deadline's been pushed to noon. I'll handle the partner." I said, "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." I said, "Thank you, Mr. Ashby." He looked at me across the car and said, "Cormac." Just that. I stayed with Renata for 3 weeks. She set up a folding cot in her spare room that smelled like paint because she was in the middle of redoing the walls, and I slept on it wrapped in a duvet she'd had since university. And I ate her pasta and watched her reality television, and slowly, very slowly, I started to feel like a person again. I got my things from the condo, while Brendan was at a meeting that I'd confirmed through his calendar, which Renata felt fine about, and which I still felt complicated about. I took what mattered, clothes, my grandmother's ring, my laptop, a small print of Algonquin Park that my dad had given me when I moved to Toronto. I left everything else. I hired a lawyer. Not the contact from Cormac's card, but someone Renata found through a friend, a woman named Sylvie in Etobicoke, who was direct and warm, and made me feel like the situation was manageable. There were no shared assets complicated enough to fight over. The condo was in Brendan's name. I'd kept my own account. It was, in the end, more straightforward than I'd expected, which was both a relief and its own particular grief, because it meant I'd given up so much and left so little mark. At work, nothing changed on the surface. I was Miss Dempsey. He was still Mr. Ashby. I processed his files, attended his meetings, drafted his correspondence, and came in every morning to the view of the lake that I still loved even in November, even with the snow starting to come off the water in thin, cold spirals. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence between us. It was the same silence. He was not a man who filled space for the sake of it, but it had a different weight now, like it was holding something, the way a room holds warmth after the people in it have left. He started asking me things, small things at first. Whether I'd managed to eat lunch, whether the new apartment, I'd found a bachelor on Ossington, small but mine, with windows that let in the late afternoon light, was working out. Whether I'd spoken to my sister. I had, actually. I'd called Joanna the morning after Renata's. I'd told her most of it. She'd cried, which made me cry, and then she'd driven down from Ottawa the following Saturday and taken me to brunch at a place near High Park with very good eggs and very bad coffee, and we'd talked for 3 hours, and I'd felt in a way I hadn't in a long time, like I was known. December came. The firm's Christmas party was at a restaurant on King West, the kind of place with exposed brick and a menu that changed seasonally and wine that came without a price on it. I wore a green dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, because the act of buying something specifically, for myself, for no reason other than wanting it, felt like a declaration. Cormac was across the room most of the night. He was always in demand at these things, the way men like him always are, surrounded by the careful architecture of professional conversation. I watched him from a comfortable distance and felt, for the first time in a long time, like I had the room to watch something without it being dangerous. Late in the evening, I was standing by the window with a glass of wine and the view of King Street below, all lit up in December, and he appeared beside me, not in front, not making it a thing. Beside me, the way he'd stood in that corridor at the Four Seasons, and I understood that this was a language he had, this besideness, this presence that didn't demand anything back. He said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Better." He said, "Better than what?" I looked at him. He was looking at the street below, not at me, which made the question easier to answer. I said, "Better than 6 months ago. Better than I've been in a while, actually." He nodded. Then he said, "Good." We stood there for a few minutes more. Then the partners' wives arrived and pulled him into another conversation. And I finished my wine and talked to Philip about his grandchildren's hockey league, and went home on the Queen streetcar and fell asleep thinking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of progress. January, I started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. An. She had an office near Christie Pitts with a very good waiting room playlist, and she had a way of asking questions that made me feel like the answers were already in the room, just waiting for me to locate them. I told her about the list. She said keeping the list was a sane response to an insane situation. She said I hadn't been stupid. I'd been in something that was designed to make leaving feel impossible. I sat with that for a long time. It didn't fix anything, but it helped. February, Cormac handed me a file with a note clipped to it. The note said, "The Nguyen account. Willa, your call on how to structure the brief." My first name, on a work note. Just there. I read it 3 times. March came in gray and wet, and then turned unexpectedly into the kind of March that reminds you why you live somewhere with 4 actual seasons. The park near my apartment on Ossington had that smell. Cold earth and snowmelt, and something green underneath. And I started running again, which I hadn't done since before I moved in with Brendan, and it felt like recovering something I'd thought was gone. On a Thursday afternoon in March, I was finishing up a research memo when Cormac stopped by my desk. It was late. Most of the office had emptied out. The light outside the windows that particular end-of-day gold that only happens in early spring. He said, "Have you eaten?" I said I'd had lunch. He said, "That's not what I asked." I looked up at him. He was holding his jacket, he said. "There's a place on Adelaide. Good chicken, unreasonable poutine. I thought, if you were finished." I thought about a lot of things in that moment. I thought about the card he'd put on my desk in July. I thought about the night in the office and the drive to Renata's and the way he'd sat down on the floor next to me, which I had never quite gotten over. I thought about my name on that note. I said, "Give me 5 minutes." It wasn't a date. It was just dinner. 2 people who'd worked alongside each other for over a year, sitting across a small table in a restaurant that was warm and not trying too hard, and talking. Actually talking. Not the professional architecture we'd built around ourselves, but the underneath of it. He told me about Halifax, about his mother's kitchen, about the 8 years in London, where he'd learned what he was made of in ways that weren't always flattering. I told him about Joanna, about the lake at my parents' house in Muskoka, about what I'd wanted to be before I was what I was. He called me Willa 3 times over the course of that dinner. I noticed every single one. We split the bill. He walked me to the Queen streetcar stop. It was cold again. March in Toronto doing what March does, and he stood with me until the streetcar came, and when it did he said, Same time next Thursday, I said. Are you asking me? He said, I am. I got on the streetcar. I rode home. I sat in my apartment with my coat still on and felt something move through me that was so different from what I'd felt standing on that dock at Calabogie. So thoroughly the opposite of that slow, gray dissolution that for a moment it was almost too much. It was the beginning. We took it slow. That part is important because it was a choice. His and mine both, made deliberately, without apology. We had dinners. We had long walks along the waterfront on Sunday afternoons, the lake doing whatever the lake does that time of year, enormous and gray-green and indifferent in the most comforting way. We talked. We disagreed about things. He thought a certain approach to the Halverson case was fine. I thought it had a gap in it, and I turned out to be right, which he acknowledged with a brevity that I had come to understand was its own form of respect. He called me Willa at work now, in front of people, and nobody blinked because it was the most natural thing, because we were the most natural thing, slow-built and sturdy in the way that something is when it's been tested before it's been offered. He called me other things too, privately, Dove, which had started as a joke about the way I sometimes tilted my head when I was reading, and became something else. I called him Cormac, which I'd been doing for a while, and sometimes Cor when I was tired or fond, which made him look at me in a way I have no adequate words for. Brendan reached out once, a long email in February, polished and careful and full of the language of accountability and growth. I read it. I sent it to Sylvie, my lawyer. She told me I had no obligation to respond, and I didn't. I mentioned the email to Cormac during a walk, not to relitigate it, but because I wanted him to know. He listened. He said, "How did it feel reading it?" I thought about it. I said, "Like finding an old receipt, something I'd already settled." He nodded. He took my hand. It was April when he asked me, the real question, not the dinner question, not the same time Thursday question. We were in Riverdale Park, the east side, where you can see the whole skyline from the hill, and on a clear day the CN Tower looks close enough to touch. It was a Sunday. The park was full of people with dogs and strollers and kites. The ordinary beautiful noise of a city in spring. He turned to me. He had something in his hand. Small, folded in a cloth, not a box, which surprised me because I'd half assumed it would be a box. It was his grandmother's ring, he told me. She'd worn it for 51 years. He'd kept it because he hadn't known what he was keeping it for until now. He said, "I'm not good at speeches." I said, "I know." He said, "I think you know what I mean." I said, "I do." He said, "Then tell me." I told him. I said, "Yes." I said it clearly, and with the full weight of everything that word had cost me to arrive at. All the mornings on that couch in Liberty Village telling myself the wrong things. All the nights on Renata's cot eating pasta in a room that smelled like paint. All the Thursdays and Sundays and walks along the water where I was slowly remembering what I was. He put the ring on my finger. It fit, which seemed almost impossible and also exactly right. The skyline was behind him and the park was loud with spring, and I stood there in Riverdale in my jacket with this ring on my hand and thought, I am so glad I made the call. Not because of him, not only, but because of who I'd been when I made it. Someone with a cracked phone and a list in her notes app, and enough left in her to pick it up and say, I don't know who else to call. That woman deserved to end up here. I am still that woman. She is still in me, and she knows it now. And the view from that hill, I have to tell you, even on the worst days of the year that followed, even when the work was hard and the city was relentless, and winter came back like it always does, I never took it for granted.